quickly. Settle down.
For 100 years, the First World War and the slaughter on the Western Front continue to fascinate students of history and cast long, dark shadows over the world in which we live. Despite all this interest and attention, popular perceptions of the Western Front remain almost totally dominated by images of futile frontal attacks in the Flanders mud and doomed youth being slaughtered at the whim of uncaring butchers and bunglers who sat in remote chateaus many miles behind the lines. Nothing could be further from the truth. Though the Great War is remembered as one of the costliest conflicts in history, much of it was fought over a relatively small and blood-soaked swath of France and Flanders. It is also striking for the great change and innovation in the art of war. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europeans and Americans were fascinated by speculations about the future. A new genre of fantasy fictions catered to their tastes. Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were the pioneers in creating tales of scientific and technological marvels, of flying machines, life below the oceans, and interplanetary travel. Only a few saw the dark side of the story, a human race that made use of its amazing possibilities by calling forth explosive new powers of destruction.
They were looking ahead to a war that they were pretty sure was going to happen. They didn't know exactly when, they didn't know exactly where, but they were pretty sure that in the not too distant future, there was going to be a war in Europe, one way or the other, and everyone wanted to have the best weaponry, the best equipment possible. And so they began to pour some money into all kinds of military technology.
Looking back, the most remarkable feature of the pre-war international landscape was the accelerating arms race. The German armaments firm Krupp was the largest single business in Europe. Its giant rivals, Skoda, Creusot, and Vickers Maxim, were also enormous. A technological breakthrough would render all existing weapons of that nature obsolete, but risk leaving the opposing country naked before its enemies during the years it required to catch up.
If you know your history of Europe, the European powers were in an arms buildup for most of the early 20th century. They were building up their navies, they were building up their armies.
The outbreak of war saw armies march to battle with the common expectation of a quick resolution, decided by rifles, field guns, cavalry, sweeping maneuvers, and fighting spirit. The traditional, professional, and relatively simple virtues of personal leadership, elan, and skill of arms were expected to carry the day.
One of the things we don't understand is that it was a brutal war, and they tried to maintain as much as they could civility during this brutal war. And it was the last chance, or the last attempt, at trying to keep your humanity, keep your sanity, and keep your graciousness and conduct as a gentleman. It was very serious to them. And it was an attempt that the technology of the time, the Maschinengewehr, the Maxim gun, the Parabellum, all of the wonderful machines of war that were developed far exceeded the tactics. At the beginning of the war, they all marched very close-knit together until they watched what a machine gun would do.
4 years later, strategy, tactics, and the material of war had been altered almost beyond recognition, and society itself had changed with them. Campaigns could now be decided by demography, citizen soldiers, technology, and industrial effort. Battles by a combination of rapid, long-range bombardments, new small unit tactics, automatic weapons, concrete, and tanks. individual will to succeed, battlecraft, the empty battlefield, and the ability to accept casualties had changed the very idea of war. The physical conditions of the fighting in the First World War aroused both fascination and disbelief. How was it that the individual soldier put up with the cold, the wet, the dirt, the noise, the frequent death of comrades, the constant danger, and the apparent inevitability, sooner or later, of personal extinction, perhaps cleanly by a bullet in the open, but much more probably by multiple wounding from a shell, by suffocation in a trench cave-in, by shock and loss of blood, or simple infection.
We took a machine gun one time with a group of friends of mine who owned an MG08-15, which is a portable machine gun. We set it up, we saw trees. They were about 6 inches in diameter, saplings. We wondered, we said, what would it be like to live fire one of these? So we put a belt in it, boom, 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 and the trees fell. So when you realize and you look at that technology and you see what it did, you say, my God.
And how was it that the extraordinary trench environment in which the millions suffered this agony came into being in the first place? To the European armies of the period, trench warfare was anathema. All subscribed with greater or lesser fervency to a doctrine of war which laid its emphasis upon mobility and maneuver, and upon the pursuit of a swift decision. It took no more than a month for years of training to fall apart. At the dawn of the 20th century, another war between the great powers was much talked about. Yet, the nature of a European war, as opposed to a colonial venture, was little understood. What was known were the many swift forays by superior forces against distant, feeble foes, machine guns against spears, massive naval firepower against antique guns. These engagements met with quick, easy victory for the Europeans. However frightening those conflicts could be for those who took part in them, the politicians at home had little sense of the horror of these new weapons. Why should war in Europe be feared? In the spring of 1914, war was a gay, droll affair. Armies marched with flags waving in the breeze, troops in brightly colored uniforms with big shiny buttons. That was about to change. The route which led the major powers of Europe to war in 1914 was long and tortuous, with many factors driving them to armed conflict. Perhaps the most important and obvious was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. That limited confrontation had seen the humiliating defeat of France and the unification of the German states under Prussian leadership. The sudden emergence of the German Empire, which, as part of the spoils of victory, took the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine from France, brought about a fundamental shift in the European balance of power. Germany's accelerated progress towards economic and military ascendancy only intensified the anxieties of her neighbors. In 1913, Germany was second only to America as the most powerful industrial nation in the world. For the better part of 2 decades, between 1871 and 1890, the new European status quo was not seriously challenged, thanks to the diplomatic dexterity and deviousness of Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor who kept France isolated. When Bismarck left office in 1890, it was not long before a fresh series of unpredictable currents began to erode the foundation of his carefully constructed continental system. A rapid deterioration in Russo-German relations and a rapprochement between Republican France and Tsarist Russia compelled Germany to strengthen her existing links with the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. This alliance ensured that she possessed an ally to the east. Germany would pay a heavy price for a policy that tied her more closely to a dilapidated empire that was itself finding it increasingly difficult to curb the nationalist aspirations of its diverse population. The potentially explosive situation in the Balkans was made more dangerous by the decline of Turkish influence. In seeking to exploit such opportunities, Austria and Russia each embarked upon a course which could only end in confrontation. The rise of Serbia added yet another hazardous element to an unstable regional mixture. Serbia had been infuriated by Austria's annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908. In turn, Serbia gained influence and territory as a result of the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, giving Austria mounting cause for irritation. With the departure of Bismarck, the belligerent and erratic Wilhelm II, who had become Kaiser in 1888, soon spurred Germany to follow a more aggressive path in international relationships. France, already determined to avenge the disaster of 1870 and win back her lost provinces, was further alarmed by Germany's developing industrial and military muscle. Russia, too, had grounds for concern about an Austro-German alliance that not only threw an ominous shadow across her western frontier, but was likely to counteract Russian interests in the Balkans. The first and probably the most significant crack in the edifice erected by Bismarckian diplomacy came in 1892, the removal of its cornerstone, the isolation of France. That year, Russia and France concluded a military agreement, reinforced by additional talks in 1893 and 1894, under which each promised to come to the other's aid if either was attacked by Germany. This change from Bismarck's realpolitik to the Weltpolitik of Kaiser Wilhelm II ultimately forced Britain to review her relations with the other leading players on the European and world stages. Britain was relatively friendly with Germany for much of the last quarter of the 19th century, not the least because Queen Victoria's eldest daughter was married to the German Crown Prince Frederick, who succeeded to the imperial throne in March 1888. When Frederick died from cancer after reigning for barely 3 months, the accession of his estranged son, Wilhelm II, heralded fresh competition with Britain for colonies and overseas markets. The new Kaiser sought world power status for Germany. His first public words as Kaiser were not to the public, but were addressed to the army.
We belong to each other, I and the army. We were born for each other and will indissolubly cleave to each other. I promise ever to bear in mind that from the world above, the eyes of my forefathers look down on me, and that I shall one day have to stand accountable to them for the glory and honor of the army.
Germany's strategic ambitions and the unique status her armed forces enjoyed within society helped ensure that, until 1916 at least, the Imperial German Army would be the elite of the First World War. Conscription, the bedrock of the German military system, permitted her to increase the size of her army swiftly from a peacetime strength of around 840,000 to more than 4 million trained soldiers when war was declared. Able-bodied young German males first joined the Landsturm at the age of 17. At the age of 20, they were called to the colors for full-time military training, which lasted 2 or 3 years, depending upon their arm of service. Thereafter, they would pass into the reserve for 4 or 5 years, and then carry out additional spells of service with the Landwehr and Landsturm until they reached 45. This system, especially the employment of reservists, was to give the Germans a significant advantage over the French army in some critical sectors along the front in the opening weeks of the war. In the summer of 1914, German infantry training was in the midst of a transition from close order to open order tactics, a factor that would cost the infantry dearly. However, the army as a whole was excellently trained, had a solid nucleus of highly capable non-commissioned officers, and could claim a clear superiority in its light, medium, and heavy howitzer weapons, which would quickly prove their worth in the operation to come. The French military system was likewise based upon conscription. In 1913, compulsory service had been extended to 3 years with the colors, then 14 in the reserve. Because her population was smaller, France had to call up a bigger proportion of the nation's men, including colonial recruits, to attain even a semblance of parity with Germany. At the outbreak of war, France was able to muster approximately 3,680,000 trained soldiers, but had fewer reserve formations than the Germans mobilized. In the wake of the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War, French military doctrine had been recast. The most important figure in this process was Lieutenant Colonel Ferdinand Foch. His teaching as commandant of the École Supérieure de Guerre placed the will to conquer firmly at the core of the French army's creed, and inspired an almost mystical faith in the primacy of the attack to the limit. The same gospel was preached by one of Foch's disciples, Colonel Louis de Grandmaison, who, between 1908 and 1911, headed the War Ministry's important operations branch. It was reflected, too, in the Army's superb quick-firing 75mm field gun, which more than matched its German 77mm equivalent, although medium and heavy artillery were given a lower priority. General Joseph Joffre, the chief of the French general and the commander-in-chief designate in the event of hostilities, accorded relatively little weight to a possible British contribution when drawing up Plan 17, the combined Allies' war plan. Traditionally shielded from invasion by the Royal Navy, Britain still had a small, long-service professional army, raised by voluntary enlistment and regarded as sufficient to police and garrison her worldwide empire. 5 separate compulsory service bills had been placed before Parliament between 1908 and 1914, but all had been defeated. The underlying problem was that in peacetime, no political party was prepared to risk the wrath of the taxpayers or commit electoral suicide by shedding the voluntary system and supporting a financially costly expansion of the Army.
First off, the Canadian Army was an entirely volunteer army. There was no draft or conscripts, so you end up getting a little bit more of a motivated individual.
The principal offensive component of the Army was the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, of 6 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, numbering approximately 120,000. Behind this were the Saturday afternoon soldiers of the territorial forces formed from the old volunteer force in 1908. Some 269,000 strong in July 1914, the territorial force had been created chiefly for home defense, but could provide a framework for future Army expansion if necessary. Both the regular Army and the territorial force were below establishment strength in 1914 and lacked heavy artillery. However, individually, the men of the BEF were better trained than any of their European counterparts and had unrivaled standards of marksmanship, with many infantrymen capable of firing 15 aimed rounds per minute.
In addition to just the normal Lee Enfield rifles and rifle grenade setups, they had Lewis gun sections and teams. We had support not directly from the Black Watch, but assigned to us were Vickers teams, which were mostly Canadian units. There were some Colt potato diggers that were used early on in the war, but as Lewis guns became more prevalent, that became the squad automatic weapon, with the Vickers being the heavy weapon.
No agreement existed which irreversibly bound the BEF to fight on the European mainland if war came. However, Anglo-French staff talks since 1906 made this possible. The British experience in the first half of the coming war would be all the more painful because the country was permitted to enter a major conflict without any blueprint for military or industrial expansion or any clear idea of the scale of effort that the coming war might require. In London, Saturday, August 1st, It was a quiet day for the officer at London's main recruiting office. Only 8 recruits presented themselves to volunteer for duty. Then came Sunday, and Monday was an August bank holiday. When he returned to his office on August the 4th, after Great Britain had declared war on Imperial Germany, the crowd waiting for him was so dense that it took him 20 minutes and the help of 20 policemen to get through to his desk. From that moment on, he worked his way through the day, testing and swearing in the recruits.
The sergeant said, "Are you willing to join?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 18 and 1 month." He said, "Do you mean 19 and 1 month?" So I thought a moment. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Right, we'll sign here, please." He said, "You realize you can go overseas."
When Lord Kitchener's first appeal went out for 100,000 new recruits, what followed was unending throughout Britain. 100 men an hour, 3,000 a day, 6,000 over the war's first weekend joined the army. So many came now that many had to be turned away. The liberal Manchester Guardian, long a platform for pacifist opinion, said in its editorial page on August the 5th, England declared war on Germany at 11 o'clock last night. All controversy is therefore at an end. Our front is united. Now there is nothing for Englishmen to do but stand together and help by every means in their power to obtain our common object, an early and decisive victory over Germany. In Munich, a crowd gathered in the Odeonplatz to celebrate the declaration of war. In the center of the crowd was a failed Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler. After leaving the plaza, he at once petitioned the King of Bavaria to be allowed to volunteer for the Bavarian army. In Paris, there was no French monarch to incite the citizens. Reservists not yet called were already putting their affairs in order. In most armies, the day before the stipulated date for reporting was a free day for farewells to family and friends. The line of trains leaving the starting areas throughout Europe was unending. The railway section of the German Great General Staff timetable accounted for the movement of 11,000 trains in the mobilization period. No less than 2,150 wagon trains, containing 54 wagons each, crossed the Hohenzollern Bridge over the Rhine between August 2nd and the 18th. The chief French railway companies had, since May 1912, a plan to concentrate 7,000 trains for mobilization. Many had been moved near the entraining centers days before the war was officially declared. Feet were as important as trains in 1914, horses' feet as well as men's feet, for after detraining in the concentration area, cavalry and infantry deployed into the line of march. There were 5,000 horses in an infantry division in 1914, more than 5,000 horses in a cavalry division. All had to be kept shod and healthy if the 20 miles in a day were to be covered, as required by the Schlieffen timetable. An infantry division on the march filled 14 miles of road, and the endurance of horses, along with that of the infantry, was pushed to the limit in the race to drive the advance forward. General von Kluck's First Army on the far right faced a march of 200 miles from detraining points to the French capital. Before Paris, however, there was Liège and Namur and the other fortresses of the Belgian rivers, which impeded any easy crossing for a German army into France. It was Austria's quarrel, but it was Germany's war. Germany struck first, westward. At 5 a.m. on August 4th, German cavalry crossed the border into neutral Belgium. The invasion of Belgium was demanded by the Schlieffen Plan.
In 1914, the Germans developed what was called the Schlieffen Plan, which was an enveloping move that went through neutral Belgium and into France to cut off the British and the French. They did great progress in the beginning.
In 1914, we were going to win the war in several weeks. Experienced officers would not buy into that. That was for public consumption. And so when we marched out in 1914, you had the cheers of the crowd, the blessings of the people, and the women who just fell at your feet. Because they thought it would all be over in 6 weeks. Certainly, we were going against the French, Look at the Franco-Prussian War. Look what we did to the French. It was going to be a simple assumption.
The Schlieffen Plan's overriding aim was to enable Germany to deal successfully with the strategic nightmare of a two-front war against both Russia and France. Failure to capture Liège and its ring of 12 forts quickly would wreck the complex German timetable at the start of the campaign. The strength of the Belgian forts had alarmed Schlieffen and his general staff successors. They were immensely strong, subterranean and self-contained, surrounded by a ditch 30 feet deep. Their thick skins would have to be broken by aimed artillery fire, and quickly, for a delay at the Meuse crossings would throw into jeopardy the smooth evolution of the Schlieffen Plan. No gun heavy enough for the work existed at the time of Schlieffen's retirement in 1906. By 1909, however, Krupp had produced a prototype of a 420mm howitzer. The Austrian Skoda company was meanwhile working on a 305mm model. It had the advantage of being road transportable. The Krupp howitzer, in its original form, had to be transported by rail and embedded for action at the end of a specially built spur track. Austria lent Germany several of its 305s. Only 5 of the Krupp rail and 2 of the new road transportable guns had been finished by August 1914. Yet Liège had to be taken. Such was the urgency that the German war plan provided for the detachment of a special task force from Second Army to complete the mission. Commanded by General Otto von Emmich, its start line was drawn between Aachen and Eupen, at the north of the narrow corridor of French territory lying between Holland and Luxembourg. The time allotted for the mission was 48 hours. It was expected by the Germans that Belgium would either not resist an invasion of its territory, or, should it do so, that its resistance would be easily overcome. Both expectations proved wrong.
The Schlieffen Plan, it was going to work just wonderfully. Not going to be a problem. After all, Belgium agreed to let us pass through with no problem, until they were talked to by the other allies and changed their mind. Then we ended up having to fight through Belgium. And what we did was, it was very quick. There wasn't much resistance. We were able to sweep through Belgium very easily. So from my standpoint, I began to see that this would be something that would be over within a reasonable time. War is a process. It's never quite an event that it takes place in a very fraction amount of time. You don't stop until you win. That's what we do. That's what the German army was to do.
The Belgian army was weak, but willing to fight behind its superb forts and hastily constructed defenses. The Belgian king also charged the commander of the Liège fortress, General Gerald Lièman, to hold to the end. Lièman was a man of honor, and despite his advanced age, of courage. He was the first true hero of the Great War, and his courage was to be tested as he faced the most powerful military force in the world. The Meuse, which he was entrusted to hold, is a mighty river. At Liège, the river runs in a narrow gorge 450 feet deep. It cannot be crossed in the face of a determined defense. So Emmich was to discover. His command entered Belgium early on the morning of August 4th. Soon they came under fire from Belgian cavalrymen and cyclist troops. Pressing on to Liège, the Germans found the bridges above and below the city blown. Emmich's task force brought 2 batteries of 210mm howitzers, the heaviest available, until the Krupp monsters could be brought forward. On the morning of August 5th, Captain Brinkmann, recently the German military attaché in Brussels, appeared in Liège to demand Lièman's surrender. He was sent packing. The German bombardment of the eastern forts opened shortly afterwards. When the infantry and cavalry attempted to advance, they found their way barred. The garrisons manning the forts returned a steady fire, while the interval troops manning the hastily dug entrenchments fought manfully whenever the German advance guards tried to penetrate the line. Throughout the night of August 5th, German casualties mounted steadily. Early in the morning of August 6th, General Erich Ludendorff, the liaison officer between Second Army and Emmich's command, rode forward into the confusion to find that the commander of the 14th Brigade had been killed. Instantly assuming the vacancy, Ludendorff fought his new command to a high point from which he could look down on Liège itself. From this vantage point, Ludendorff ordered forward a party under a flag of truce to demand Lehmann's surrender. Once again, Lehmann refused. Ludendorff's bold assault did prompt Lehmann to leave the city and take refuge in Fort Lonsin. On the Western Front, a moment of equilibrium was reached among the opposing forces. The German right wing was immobilized by a handful of Belgian fortress troops guarding the crossing, the possession of which the future of military events in the West turned. The equilibrium was upset by Ludendorff. Large in physique and personality, he resolved on the morning of August 7th to launch the 14th Brigade into the center of Liège. Driving up to the gates of the old citadel, he hammered on the door with the pommel of his sword.
I arrived. No German soldier was to be seen, and the citadel was still in the hands of the enemy. I banged on the gates, which were locked. They were opened from the inside. The few hundred Belgians that were there surrendered at my summons.
The surrender of the garrison gave him possession of the city. His bold sortie had put the bridges into German hands. He decided to return post-haste to Aachen and urge forward Second Army to complete his success. While he was away, Emmech's task force broke the resistance of Fort Barchon and Evnier. The first road-transportable Krupp 420 eventually arrived within range of Fort Pontis on August 12th. The crew lay prone some 300 yards away while the gun was fired electrically.
60 seconds ticked by, the time needed for the shell to traverse its 4,000-meter trajectory, and everyone listened in for the telephone report of our battery commander.
The first of the shells, with a delay fuse to explode only after penetration of the fort's protective skin, fell short. The eighth struck home. Then the gun fell silent for the night. The next morning, the Krupp gun was joined by others which had just completed the journey from Essen. The Germans began the bombardment anew. By 12:30, Fort Pontis was a wreck, and it surrendered. Fire then shifted to Fort Emberg, which surrendered at 5:30. Fort Chafontaine had been destroyed by the explosion of its magazine at 9 o'clock. On August 14th, it was the turn of Fort Liège at 9:40 a.m., and Fleron at 9:45. Finally, on August 15th, the howitzers reduced Fort Lonsin, to which General Lehmann had shifted his headquarters 9 days earlier. After 140 minutes of bombardment, the magazine was penetrated and the fortress destroyed. Concrete was turned to rubble and human flesh to bloody pulp. Amid the ruins, General Lehmann was found lying insensible. To Emmech, he said from the stretcher on which his captors placed him, "I ask you to bear witness that you found me unconscious." The last two forts, Holland and Flamel, surrendered without a fight on August 16th. The Krupp and Skoda guns were then broken out of their emplacements and diverted toward the forts of Namur, where they repeated the victory of Liège after a 3-day bombardment on August 24th. These two victories spelled the end of a 300-year-old military trust in the power of fortresses. Liège had fallen, but far to the south, the French army was on the move. The French, too, had a plan, simple and to the point.
Whatever the circumstances, it is the Commander-in-Chief's intention to advance. All forces united to the attack of the German armies.
Whatever the circumstance, the French army would advance. Whatever the circumstance, in full strength. Whatever the circumstance, through the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, on to the Rhine. Whatever the circumstance, the pride of France would march on. The French infantry would march still dressed in the red uniforms of 50 years before. Amid the uniforms of old France was a touch of Africa, Zouaves from Algeria and Morocco, and the famous French Foreign Legion. The cavalry, too, would advance, still wearing uniforms worn at Waterloo, but eager to charge and slash the German enemy. With uniforms drawn from history and ideas drawn from fiction, the Army was up to date in one respect. It had the finest field gun in the world, the 75 millimeter. Flexible and mobile, it was capable of firing 25 rounds per minute, and the French Army had them in great numbers. Europe's two greatest powers were set to collide. The French War Plan 17 was first put to the test on August 6th, when General Bonneu's 7th Corps advanced into the Green Mountains of Upper Alsace. The French army was able to retake Mulhausen, and for the first time in 44 years, it once again became Mulhouse. Bonneau was soon obliged by German troops from Strasbourg to retire in disorder, and Mulhouse was once again Mulhausen.
The French retreated in such a haste that we actually had to run after them. At first we found heaps of French army blankets, which the soldiers had thrown away. Then we found French greatcoats. Then we found French knapsacks. Then we found French belts with ammunition pouches full of cartridges. And finally, in barns hidden or sitting just on the roadside, the exhausted French soldiers.
On August 14th, Joffre ordered the army of Alsace under General Paul to try again. Once again, Mulhausen became a French city, but in a matter of hours reverted to its German name. As threats to the Allied left and center developed, Joffre had to withdraw Pau's formations for use elsewhere along the front. Mulhausen would remain in German hands for the foreseeable future. These opening moves left the French with only a small corner of Alsace in the eastern foothills of the Vosges. The principal thrust into Lorraine by Duval's First Army and de Castelnau's Second Army also began on August 14th. The French advanced as liberators and not conquerors. The thought that the Germans might have plans of their own appears not to have crossed anyone's mind in the French High Command. Schlieffen had intended for the German left-wing armies to give ground, enticing the French forces away from the decisive right wing. For 4 days, the Germans fell back, contesting but not firmly opposing the French advance. Then the front lost its sponginess. The French infantry found German resistance stiffening. The French First Army was not firmly in contact with the Second, west of the Saar Valley. Duval and de Castelnau were not in operational touch at all. Duval was conscious of the weakness and intended on August 20th to mend it by launching an attack that would both restore contact and open a way through Connaught's cavalry corps to debouch into the enemy's rear. But as he set the attack in motion on the night of August 19th, the Germans were preparing to unleash their planned counteroffensive. Luck fell on the German side. The armies of Ruprecht and Heeringen had been temporarily subordinated to a single staff. Thus, while the French Second and First Armies coordinated their actions only as well as sporadic telephoning could arrange, the German 6th and 7th fought as a single entity. Duval's night attack was checked as soon as it began. The setback was followed by a simultaneous offensive along the whole line of battle by 8 German corps against the French 6. So it was that the commands on both sides entered into a zone of uncertainty. The test soon became a test of nerves in which Germany was at a disadvantage. The man in charge of the Kaiser's vast army was a man of unsteady nerves. General von Moltke was a cultured, thoughtful, reasonable man, but he was also a sick one and an uncertain man. Now, as the French were about to advance once again into Alsace and to launch a grand all-out offensive into Lorraine, von Moltke's indecisions grew upon him. The ambitions of other generals also came into play. When Crown Prince Rupert of Bavaria proposed a counterstrike by his 6th Army and von Heeringen's 7th Army, Moltke, seduced by the prospect of enveloping both French flanks, let them proceed. The subsequent actions at Cherbourg and Morhange on August 29th rapidly revealed that for the French infantry, offensive spirit would not by itself triumph over modern artillery and machine guns. The French, suffering enormous losses, were pushed back on their own frontier fortifications. Here, however, they mustered sufficient strength and resolve to organize a successful defense of Nancy and the Moselle line. The modifications to their original plan had not enabled the Germans to deal the French right a mortal blow. And as the fighting in this region became less intense, Joffre could again transfer troops to buttress the Allied center and the left. On the other hand, having vastly underestimated the extent to which the Germans would use reservists, and still unaware of the real width of the German drive through Belgium, Joffre misjudged the strength of the German center. Ordered to advance northeast into the Ardennes, Ruffey's Third Army and de Langle de Cary's Fourth Army blundered into German forces around Neufchâteau and Virton on August 21st and 22nd, and were bloodily repulsed.
We were shot down like rabbits, because for them it was a real target, because we had red trousers and they were down in the hole themselves. Then we had to retreat, of course. We lie down for a certain while, try to make some holes, and after that, when we could do nothing, we had to retreat back.
If the French plan seemed to be thrown into a cocked hat, Moltke's overall handling of German operations was even less certain than that of the French. On August 17th, he made a misguided effort to improve the coordination of the German right wing, placing Kluck under the orders of the more cautious Bülow. This irritated the pugnacious Kluck and also inhibited him from swinging the first. By the 19th, the true scale of German strength and movement began to dawn upon Lanrezac, the French Fifth Army commander. As he approached the Sambre and Meuse between Charleroi and Givet, he found the German Second and Third Armies advancing towards him from the north and east through Belgium. His warning caused some at French General Headquarters to brand him a defeatist. But as Bülow's forces crossed the Sambre on August 21st, and the French counterattack failed on the 22nd, all hopes of a French offensive to the northeast evaporated. On August 22nd, displaying untypical impetuosity, and without waiting for Hausen's Third Army, Bülow pressed the French back an additional 5 miles. This counteracted the planned effect of Hausen's Musée crossing on August 23rd. With the French Fifth Army farther south, it was correspondingly harder to attack its rear. Even so, when Hausen appeared on his right, Lanrezac felt that he must act immediately to avert disaster. By the time Lanrezac realized the danger he was in, the British Expeditionary Force, under Field Marshal Sir John French, had reached the Maubeuge-les-Cateaux area on the Allied left.
The BEF, small of a contingent as it was and present in France at the time, was a professional army. They were disciplined. They were great shots. Their officers were, top notch, and they put a hurting on the Germans at Mons.
For once in British history, an army was taking to the field with great efficiency. 1,800 special trains had carried them to their ports of embarkation. On one day alone, 80 trains ran into Southampton docks. An average of 50,000 tons of shipping per day, safe and unhindered under the protection of the Royal Navy, carried the Expeditionary Force to France. Landings in France began in deep secrecy on August 7th. Each day, the Royal Flying Corps would fly its recon. Some flights would find nothing, but one scouting over the old battlefield of Waterloo was more fortunate.
We found the whole area completely covered with hordes of field grey uniforms and heavy stuff, transport, guns, and what have you, coming towards us. In fact, it looked as though the place was alive with the Germans.
Returning to base, the pilot was rushed off to Sir John French to tell him what he had seen.
And I showed him a map all marked out. He said, "Have you been over that area?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And I explained what I'd seen, and they were enormously interested and then they began reading the figures that I'd estimated, whereupon I seemed to feel that their interest faded. They seemed to look at each other and shrug their shoulders. And then French turned round to me and said, "Now, yes, my boy, this is terribly interesting, but tell me all about an airplane."
Those who were pushing for the use of aircraft, the very early airmen, as it were, they saw tremendous potential for the aircraft as not just an observation, artillery spotting kind of task, which is what most of the generals saw it as. And they complained over and over again that the ground generals simply didn't understand what this machine could do for them. And were wasting it, using it simply for observation or for reconnaissance or for photographing or whatever they were using it for, and that it could be an offensive weapon.
Despite his exposed position and the onrushing German army, Sir John promised to cover Lamberzac's left by standing at Mons for 24 hours. There would be no grand offensive. The British army was digging in. Second Corps manned the line on the Mons-Conde Canal and a small salient around the town, while Lieutenant General Sir Douglas Haig's First Corps was to its right. For a time, Kluck was ignorant of the British deployment across his axis of advance. During the misty morning of Sunday, August 23rd, Kluck's leading corps ran headlong into the BEF position.
Quite suddenly, out of the blue, we saw cavalry coming towards us. They'd come out of the right, on our right flank. I said, "Good gracious, it's Germans." So we immediately started to fire.
By 9 o'clock, both sides were having at it. The Germans made a succession of piecemeal, badly coordinated assaults against Smith-Dorrien's position in the salient and along the canal. The British quickly became acquainted with the power and accuracy of German artillery.
We were in the trenches waiting for them, but we didn't expect anything like the smashing blow that struck us. All at once the sky began to rain down bullets and shells. I saw shells bursting to right and left of me, and I saw many a good comrade go out.
Then German infantry came forward in solid square blocks, surging towards the canal and its crossing. The BEF's incomparable musketry roared to life, exacting a terrible toll from the dense German formations.
They were in solid square blocks, standing out sharply against the skyline, and you couldn't help hitting them. We lay in our trenches with not a sound or sign. They crept nearer and nearer, and then our officers gave the word. The German seemed to stagger like a drunk man suddenly hit between the eyes, after which they made a run for us, shouting some outlandish cry that we couldn't make out.
Poor devils of infantry. They advanced in companies of quite 150 men in files 5 deep. The first company were simply blasted away to heaven by a volley at 700 yards, and in their insane formation, every bullet was almost sure to find 2 billets. They had absolutely no chance.
This was a mad minute, 15 rounds of aimed rifle fire that the British infantry alone was trained to do. At Mons, it did the trick. The Germans were shot flat.
Our first battle is a heavy, an unheard of heavy defeat. And against the English we laughed at.
Well entrenched and completely hidden, the enemy opened up a murderous fire. The casualties increased and the rushes became shorter. With bloody losses, the attack came to an end. It was all to no avail. On the left flank, German pressure began to build. The French Fifth Army was falling back, exposing the British flanks. Although Haig's First Corps was not heavily pressed, Smith-Dorrien's troops largely held on until late in the afternoon, when relentless German pressure and numerical superiority finally broke the Tommies. Orders were issued to fall back. The retreat from Mons had begun.
We were very disappointed when we got the order that we have to break off battle and retreat. To do this is not an easy thing. It's quite easy to join battle, but it's not easy to break it off. However, we put down a curtain fire between us and the Germans, which enabled the infantry and cavalry to get away.
Up to all the tricks of the trade from their experience of small wars, the English veterans brilliantly understood how to slip off at the last moment.
Accordingly, First Corps fell back about 2 miles to pre-selected positions. The VEF had performed well on its first important battle, keeping Kluck's First Army at bay for the best part of the day. Most of the British 1,600 casualties were in Second Corps. On came the Germans. The Schlieffen plan was still on time and target. That night, the threat to the French Fifth Army's right near Denton prompted Lanrezac to withdraw without consulting Joffre or the British. The BEF had no alternative but to conform to Lanrezac. The whole Allied line was in retreat, and thousands of frightened homeless people joined the armies on the roads west.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. To be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as Rebellion is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? All balls right, turn.